Hey everyone, this is Anna Gressel, and you're listening to the AI Drop, your briefing on how AI is reshaping the future of business, law, and industry. We bring you fresh drops each week so you never miss a beat. Welcome to the podcast. Today we're getting into a question that sits underneath almost everything happening in AI right now. When you can no longer tell whether a photo, a voice, or a video is real, and how we keep trust and information from falling apart. And to help us unpack that, I'm super excited to welcome Claire Leibowicz to the podcast. Claire is the director of AI, Trust, and Society at the Partnership on AI, better known as PAI, where she's worked since 2018. And she's also more recently led the development of PAI's Responsible Practices for Synthetic Media, a framework she built with major companies and organizations. And her team helped shape transparency provisions in the EU's Code of Practice for AI-generated content. Claire, welcome to the AI Drop.
Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
I want to kick us off with a lightning round. So the way this works is I will give you a question and just react to it. Claire doesn't know the questions in advance, everyone.
Yeah, this is scary.
So one word, when you see a piece of media today, what's your gut reaction before you analyze it? Trust it, doubt it, or it depends?
It depends. You're making it sound like I'm even thinking about it. It's so visceral.
One of the things that I love is I have a newsletter that comes to me every day, and it has like a little bit of a test, like an A or B option for whether something's synthetic. And I get it wrong a lot of the time. It's very humbling.
Yeah, even experts.
Yeah. Well, okay. So 2 years from now, will the average person be more or less able to tell real media from synthetic media?
Hopefully more, if we get this right.
Fill in the blank. The most underrated risk in this space right now is
forgetting about algorithmic and chatbot-based distribution of content.
I worked on a DOJ investigation into those issues back in the day. So you're really bringing me back.
Yeah, we haven't solved them, and they're still affecting what we see and how we see it.
Claire, let's start a little bit at the foundation of PAI, because I'd love to have our listeners get to know PAI a bit. What is the multi-stakeholder model at the heart of PAI, and why is it a helpful way to tackle really challenging cutting-edge problems like synthetic media?
So PAI's origin story speaks volumes to how we do our work, and it's also just really interesting. We were founded by the heads of AI research at some of the largest technology companies, so like Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, Google. And these were the people leading AI labs who were interested in social computing, is kind of what we called it at the time before responsible AI was trendy. And they felt they can't answer these huge societal questions about how AI was touching daily life and what it means to be human alone, but they would need reps from civil liberties, orgs, and many others to think about the impact of this technology and how we build responsible technology. So we have now over 140 partners from around the world. And the premise is you kind of need to understand how people are affected by this technology, but you also need highly empowered technical experts to translate those goals into real ones and zeros and the actual technology that's being built. So through this kind of disagreement and convening and norm and insight generation, we can really move the field, address emergent problems, and ultimately build better technologies.
Well, I love that the mission of PAI always seems to keep pace with the rate of change in technology. I think better than many organizations, probably because you are in the room with developers and companies, and they are sharing the challenges that they have. I mean, when I think back, just even maybe it was a year or two ago when we were starting to talk about governance challenges around agents, one of the organizations I work with, PAI is really beginning to put together some of the leading thinking on this. And you were the first organization to be doing that I had heard of. And so, I always feel like you're ahead of the game. Can you talk about what that's looked like for you? I mean, you joined in 2018. That's when I started doing AI work too in the legal sphere. And that feels like a billion years ago.
Yeah, I actually think we met in that era. I was telling colleagues and I was like, it feels like the Ice Age. But the reality is it's not that long ago. And I give this anecdote of we hosted a dinner in 2019 about how we release GPT-2 and think about how powerful it is. And when you say GPT-2, it sounds archaic, but it's the same questions we're asking now. So I think that kind of field-wide proximity, it's not just the companies being in the room. It's also the kind of productive tension, that's a cheesy term, that comes when there are advocates who think about human rights and what these technologies mean, that really forces the conversation to go a layer deeper. So I'll give one example. It's also vivid imagery. We were in the old broadcasting house of the BBC, which is beautiful but stuffy as a room. And we were co-hosting a workshop in 2019 on what was then described as the emergent threat of AI-generated media, because those who work in video and human rights were very nervous that records of reality would not hold. Even in the legal profession, there was concern about what constitutes evidence. And we were having these conversations and they felt a bit ahead. And it's funny because multi-stakeholder efforts sometimes are kind of diminished as taking too long. But you're bringing up this really interesting capacity for them, which is to bring unlikely groups together, level up to a field-wide societal impact aperture, and then be able to say, look, agents are coming. Synthetic media is going to change how we date, how we practice law, and kind of identify that so then the field can respond with its own expertise and have more time to, as some of my colleagues say, prepare and not panic.
Yeah, I do think that these efforts can be much faster than what we see in the news, really, when we're talking about those particularly cutting edge problems. And Claire, I wonder, when you think about how you do your job, I'm so curious, are there particular skills that you think are helpful in surfacing those tensions and working through them?
Having to see something from the perch of not being at any one of these institutions and seeing how they all relate. I don't know if that's purely facilitation or also kind of omnipotence makes it sound crazy, but this almost like the way a journalist swoops in. They're not an expert on the topic, but they kind of have this intellectual humility. I'd say that's the skill that you don't know as much as all the people who are in the room, but that if you can ask good questions, you can learn about how all their work relates to each other. So PAI is not a traditional advocacy organization. We're an independent 501c3. So while we were founded with deep proximity to leaders at companies, there are many times we've kind of moved in a slightly different direction, and you're never going to have full consensus. So I think part of my job is interpersonal, part of it is intellectual, and part of it is thinking about when consensus is never going to be completely possible without succumbing to a least common denominator, what's the maybe option C when we're making trade-offs between A and B that kind of reconciles where we are, but still moves the field forward. So a long-winded way, if I can go back and say, I'm a facilitator, but it's also my job to have enough expertise on the field to be able to be taken seriously and to kind of funnel the conversation into a productive and forward-moving way.
I relate to that because I think often, lawyers are seen as providing analysis. And actually, I think when we add the most value, we provide solutions. And it is, to your point, sometimes option C or D or E that provides the most creative unlock. So it's one of my favorite parts of the job is brainstorming like mitigations and guardrails and working with the people who work on those. And there's so many lawyers that tirelessly work on the right guardrails. So I love having the chance to collaborate on those with them. Let's talk about transparency. I really want to pick up that strain because, transparency is often not seen as an end in itself. It's a means to an end. And there are a lot of different kinds of transparency for different purposes. Tell us a little bit about how you think about transparency within the AI space.
I'll focus on the area that I've been interested in for the past several years, which is credibility of information and how we ensure that we maintain our shared belief in what's real and accurate as technology makes that harder. And transparency there has meant thinking about how we can know what's happened to content, how it's been edited, how it's been changed, who's touched it. Perhaps we'll come to that later about the who being really challenging. And the premise there has always been not transparency, to your point, vaguely, just to give you a ton of information, but it will help audiences make sense of what's credible and how to form trust judgments about content today. And so in our synthetic media framework, which was a voluntary policy with buy-in from 18 very varied organizations who have different attitudes, frankly, probably about even transparency, but they're all kind of unified in this belief that we need to help audiences and ourselves, if we're distributing content, understand what's happening to it. So in that regard, the premise is, can we give people enough information without a normative assessment of if that information, is there something that might make that quick judgment about photo slower or help me actually pause and see what's the deal with that piece of content. So in our framework, there's a stipulation that people at different tiers of the value chain of technology development and deployment need to think about transparency. And that's as far as upstream at the model level, that we want model developers to bake these kind of, not to get in the weeds, but technical ways of identifying if content has been tweaked with AI, such that downstream, when a distributor, let's say, or an enterprise is trying to use those models, they can understand what's happening with content and maybe even eventually get those signals to an end user, which is what we care most about, which is people making sense of the world around them. And this strand has come up in the EU AI Act, and it's palatable to people who are trying to balance expression and leaving room for freedom of expression and not dictating what's true and false, but also giving more information such that it could perhaps help users come to their own conclusions. I think there's something very interesting about this kind of tension that stakeholders face between wanting to provide useful transparency that users actually understand, while also not dipping their toe into being arbiters of truth. And we run into a lot of tension about what it means for there to be useful transparency, as we've seen in lots of other disclosure mandates, whether it's like cigarette warnings, nutrition labels. Prop 65 in California, we've all seen a label on a couch that says this may give you cancer. That's not a really useful form of transparency in my mind. And I think there's a lot to learn from those domains in the transparency for media and information today.
So, Claire, for the folks who are not as deep in the weeds on the synthetic media framework, I know a lot of people are very deep in the weeds on it. Tell us a little bit about the different kinds of disclosures and watermarks and tools that different kinds of companies have at their disposal to chip away at the transparency problem. I know that each of them serves a different kind of purpose, and I think AI has done a great job of articulating that.
So we like to break down these types of transparency signals as being indirect and direct. And the indirect ones are kind of the technical, more inside baseball stuff about how you actually build these into machines. And then the direct ones are more what you then could see as a human being, that maybe on our screen, I'm using a special voice manipulator and Anna might see a label that says Claire is augmenting her voice with AI. So those are just very different examples. And in the case of indirect disclosure, those are techniques for baking in signals at the technical level that travel with a piece of content over time. If I am taking a video on my phone and then it has this mark that's put into that video that connotes when it was taken and what it was captured on, and that can then, if I upload it to social media, travel with the piece of content and identify if it's been tampered with AI or not. In the field, there's an initiative in the technical standards world called the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, which is an attempt to standardize these technical mechanisms such that there'll be a consistent, interoperable way to basically stamp content with these authentication signals. There are also other techniques, watermarks and fingerprinting, which are slightly different in nature. It's like, is something innate to the piece of content that you then match, like a fingerprint? Or is it more like a tattoo that you have to actively stamp? And there's also detection, which is slightly different and doesn't require any insertion of an artifact, but rather allows you to kind of look after the. So these are all the things that can happen in a piece of content. But then the question is, then what? And on the one hand, these signals might help when that social media platform ingests the piece of content, that cool video that you took. They can then say, this was tampered with AI. It doesn't say anything about how or to what end, or if it was just something that was immaterial, which is a really important point. And then they can decide what they show end users. So if I'm now scrolling through a feed, if I see made with AI or AI info, that's the result of ingesting these back-end signals that were added way upstream that must hopefully have been consistent and not tampered with, and therefore eventually being translated to these direct disclosures, which are the Claire is using an AI tool to manipulate her voice that Anna may or may not care about.
Well, and I think you're bringing up such important points because we hear about this a lot actually from courts that are really struggling with feeling completely inundated with content that they can't really tell is fake or real, or even if they have a signal, hard to decide or determine what part of that content has been tampered with. And I think your phone example is right on point, because one of the early cases we saw in this area was just an allegation that someone used their phone to edit or enhance a video. And so it doesn't even necessarily take an advanced AI kind of separate tool to do this. We don't necessarily need these bespoke software programs to edit video. It's inherent in a lot of the devices and software programs we use right now. And for courts, like even just grappling with the fact that when you take a photo on your phone, there are a lot of components that are inherently enhanced by that. I mean, night mode is essentially that, right? I think that's an extremely difficult problem for them. So your point is so well taken that we may not know what has been edited when there's a signal there.
And can I add, you're bringing up the most fundamental part of this conversation. This isn't a conversation about synthetic media or AI. This is a conversation about true and false, real and fake, and what it means to misrepresent or impersonate in the AI age. And those are very important framings, as silly as that may seem, because I may actually be more worried that your wonderful podcast producer, who I met at the beginning of this conversation, might edit me and alter this audio track in a way that paints me not in the best light. Hopefully, he goes the opposite way. But that's an example of quote unquote manipulation of media that may misrepresent some of the things that I've said, more so than if he just uses a back-end tool that makes my voice sound clearer or purer using AI. And I would argue that if I'm a listener, I would care much more about that malevolent manipulation by just using those low-tech tools than an AI voice enhancer to make me sound clearer and get rid of the New York City background noise behind me.
This question often comes up in different contexts with AI, which is, do we measure the harm against the harm that people can do without AI? And there are plenty of other tools that people can use in all kinds of contexts to misuse different types of technologies or tools. And one of them is just like copying and pasting or clipping or editing in that way. Do you think that that information should be part of what is transmitted to users? So in a court situation, do you need something to say, this is the part of the video that's been edited? This is the piece of the content that has been changed? Or maybe it's everything all at once because we're flooded with that information regardless?
I think it depends on the context, which is unfortunate but honest answer. In a courtroom, I think having that level of granularity where there's time for deliberation and a jury is going through something, that would be really important. If I'm a user scrolling through a social media feed, the question is, how often am I going to click and read a set of descriptions? Or what does it mean to signal to me the relevant information? And I think it would be very different in that context. I do think what you're bringing up is what is vital in disclosure and when is disclosure vital? And this question of material changes is one that we think about a lot. How do you provide, quote unquote, more transparency or different transparency in contexts that might be more material to the environment that they're in, whether that's a court or someone determining if a politician is trustworthy on their social media feed? And to me, that's the fundamental question. How do you get at materiality and tailor disclosure based on that, while also not being so prescriptive and ad hoc that it becomes unwieldy or becomes kind of just like fact checking?
One of the things I also want to push on is one of the really interesting parts of the research, which is that sometimes these labels can also backfire and, lead to a false sense of security or casting doubt on authentic content. Some people have called it the deepfake defense, saying like, that's not me. Like my husband just edited that photo and that's actually AI when it is really true content. I mean, it's, and so this question of, can you just point a finger at something and say, that's a deepfake, that's not real, and how much societal harm does that cause as well?
Yeah, and I think I'm even more worried about that. We call it, actually, was legal scholars, Danielle Citron at UVA now and Bobby Chesney at UT, who coined the term the liar's dividend several years ago. So I like deepfake defense. I love alliteration, but also liar's dividend, the idea being that you don't need AI to cast doubt. And the mere prospect of AI makes it easier to say, that's just fake. That real content is AI generated. So I'm very worried about that. I think the content authenticity tools are attempting to prove real as opposed to just prove fake, which is actually pretty semantically important difference. So it can help kind of get around a bit of the liar's dividend issue. But at the scale of society and the way that inevitably some of these tools will get lost, it's definitely a concern. And I think the pace of the information environment is something we don't think about a ton, but how quickly people are consuming content, how much there is, makes all of these artifact level defenses really hard for people making sense of. And it makes it therefore easier to just discredit the one out of a million pieces of content that someone's seeing over the course of even 30 minutes.
Actually, it reminds me a little bit of an article that came out recently saying just the perception that happens from media we know is not real can be so pervasive within the news cycle. People are not necessarily even putting out deepfakes anymore. They're putting out altered content of themselves where you know it's altered, and it still affects our perception. It still affects the way that we see the world. So much of this, I think you're right to say, so much of this is about this broader information ecosystem and how we treat the behaviors that happen as a result of that. But the signals, of course, are part of creating the boundaries of where that ecosystem can kind of go and what really the perceptions look like in practice. You're right. It's a split-second judgment for so many people.
Or is it even, it's visceral. That's what I said at the beginning. It's almost subconscious how quickly, and visual artifacts are much more kind of primitive in some ways. And this is an interesting moment where young people are getting their news through short form videos. Visual language is extremely important today at the same exact time that it's becoming so easy to scroll past, discredit, and mislead using those images.
So I want to change track just a little bit and talk about what is different when we add agents to the equation here. Do we enter a completely different trust ecosystem when agents are not just generating content, they're moving content, they're accessing content. They are in many ways the first point. I think they will become the first point in how we interrelate to each other. I mean, people keep joking, but I think we are in some ways heading towards a world of my agent will talk to your agent. And what does that mean for the information ecosystem?
Well, I hope that means we can talk more. We talked at the beginning about cloning ourselves. But in all seriousness, how I think about this stepwise change, if it is stepwise versus a paradigm shift, is these agents don't just look like me or sound like me. They may behave like me and perceive like me and act autonomously or semi-autonomously, depending upon the laws that we construct, like me or not like me at certain times, which is where I think we'll run into the real complexity. And many of the solutions for transparency that maybe worked in artifact level content, like videos, to say this is a video that hasn't been changed, require very different understanding when applied to, or frankly, not just understanding, but also techniques when applied to behavior. That opens up a new surface area of risk. It opens up a new surface area of technical ways that we need to build to monitor these agents over time. PAI has new work that's about to come out on what can we currently even observe about agents? How can we monitor data about what they're doing and telemetry? And that may sound really inside baseball about technology, but those are the ultimate ways that we'll know if an agent went off the rails or when it kind of defied its initial plan. And I think this introduces a set of questions about how do we know I'm interacting with a person that are slightly different than just am I interacting with a deepfake or not, or seeing a deepfake. It's is this a person behind this? Has it been authorized by a person? And what level of human oversight is sufficient in different contexts as these systems are going out in the world?
Yeah, I mean, you guys have talked a lot about this concept of personhood credentials, and just there have been questions in the synthetic media space about what information needs to be conveyed. I think there are really interesting questions about what information needs to be conveyed from a personhood credential perspective. I mean, do I need or want to convey that I'm a lawyer? When would that be appropriate? Or do you just figure that out from context? There's so much about this that I think we could pull on in terms of how we present to the world, what our own identity means to other people, and how important it is or not that our agents carry that identity. I mean, maybe I want a personal agent that is completely separate from any agent I might use in the workplace.
Yeah. And this gets at, it's almost like you're going to travel with a little virtual driver's license that's in your back pocket that might be what you need to enter lots of spaces, which also presents a whole set of privacy questions and who's going to run this personhood verification software. Even in the content authenticity space, in the synthetic media domain, we see a lot of pushback that we don't want to identify that this came from this camera. That's going to become even more complex when it goes to identifying that it's actually Anna or a real person, because if that is in an authoritarian context or in a surveillance context, that increases the surface area of risk even bigger than just the content authenticity world. There are big, big, big questions about what does it matter, what we know, when does it matter, and ultimately, how do we make sure you're doing CAPTCHA 2.0? I think we all have those increasingly difficult prove you're not a robot moments on the computer. I sometimes don't pass them.
Feel those all the time. No, literally, it's a big issue for me.
Me too. And I'm like, what does this say about who I am as a person that I failed this little puzzle? But jokes aside, this is kind of CAPTCHA on steroids. It's, are you a real person? And that will become increasingly important in high stakes decisions. And maybe it's that I need to know you are not just a real person, but a lawyer if you are going into the court of law or writing a memo or kind of being able to act in that way, or that you've authorized that agent. And I think these are the big societal questions that we have not yet resolved, that also are contingent upon how good our technology is on the back end in order to trace and understand what's going on.
Absolutely. And it's not just what do other people understand about me and my agent and whether the agent is acting on my behalf. Sometimes I think the questions, which you alluded to earlier, are also about what does the agent say about what it's doing? And is that something we can trust? I mean, there's been a lot of work on deceptive alignment, for example, or alignment faking, where the agent says it's doing something, it actually does something else. So do you rely on the content produced by the agent to give you a signal about what the agent is doing, or do you have to rely on something else to get you that signal? So there's this whole new agentic trust ecosystem that is evolving. I'm so excited to read what you guys are about to put out on this. And Claire, I would love to have you back on to talk about it if you'd be willing.
I would talk to you whenever. There's a ton of work that needs to happen on agent monitoring and what that means for big societal questions and how we think about identity and who should be in charge and the privacy implications. These are big questions that will continue for a while. So yeah, thank you. We'd love to have you involved.
Wonderful. Okay, Claire. Well, thank you again for joining us on the AI Drop, and we'll look forward to part 2.
Thank you so much.
That's today's drop. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more of the AI Drop, hit subscribe and join us each week for fresh insights on what's shaping the future of AI. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and it does not constitute legal advice or establish an attorney-client relationship. It may be considered attorney advertising, so prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. The views expressed here are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of their firms, organizations, or clients. For more information, please visit freshfields.com.